And yeah, I'm not sure. Ryan says he can come sometimes, but he blocked out a lot of the summer. Like, not sure how existent he is.
1 minute, I'll be right back.
Yeah. So maybe, Chris, this is only for you because you're the only one here who has to lead a report, but Kartik, I'm guessing you'll be closely involved with yours. We'll talk about those more next week, but in the meantime, so you could get familiar with the kind of structure that NSF asks for, I've posted reports for everyone. So I haven't done reporting on a project known as collaborative before, and collaborative means that money flows to each institution instead of flowing through the main institution and being spread out from that institution. So the blessing of that mechanism is that we don't have to pay overhead, like double overhead on the money that gets sent to your institution. But then the curse is that each institution has to do its own reporting. But since this project is supposed to be collaborative and demonstrating convergence, I think it would be wise for us to develop our reports side by side and then talk about how they connect rather than each group sending in a completely separate report. So that's all I'm going to say about that right now. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, Chris. And the questions are sorry.
I was sorry. I was trying to unmute myself and open up this thing at the same time. So yeah, I am kind of glancing at it now.
And so the questions I find to be kind of weirdly posed, but I think they come out of the need for accountability to certain higher ups. And so I'll be filling in what are the main goals of this project, and then this institution is working on this one. And then I'm hoping that y'all can fill in the rest. And what I usually do is they give you 8,000 characters, which is about 1,000 words. So that's substantial. If I can present something without figures, then I write it in there. If I'm already writing a paper and I have a lot of it done, I just kind of shorten up that paper, submit it as an appendix, and summarize it in the box. So I try not to make this become very arduous. And yet you have to think who's reading these. It's the program manager. They're super busy. They just really want to go through and make sure your project is going okay. Individuals may have certain things that they're looking for. And I don't know what those are, right? So I try to bring the important stuff to the top. Say, you give an executive summary, like we did this, this, and this, and then here's the detail on it. So those are some things to think about as you begin preparing. And next week, we're going to talk about what each group is going to put forward, and then how those will be integrated. So I'll ask for your input well before the progress report is due so that I have time to review them. I will likely ask for updates, so don't be taken aback if I do. But I'll probably say, I think you need to say a little more about this because I think that's a really important part. And then in our part, then I'll do the integration. Like, this is how these things are working together, so that can be seen. And all of that takes time. Like it usually takes me, I don't know, half a day minimum to finish a report when I have all the pieces. And then that amount of time has to be found somewhere. which takes even longer. So just so you know, that's why I ask for things well ahead of time. So that's a preview of next week, but you all have things that you can look at. And then another thing to note, in the first year, it is really awkward because you're working on, they want the report like right at the 1 year. And so you're really writing about stuff that you hoped would be done in the first year. I find it really useful to only report on things that are truly done, not things that you wish were done. You may feel like, oh my gosh, I haven't even had a year. You know, I want to say more. I want to stretch it out a little bit. But then what you're doing is you're shorting yourself on next year. So just be honest about if your conference is on October 3rd, that conference goes in next year. All right. Any questions about that? And we'll have plenty of time for questions next week. Okay. And then Ellison, I'm going to give you the floor. This is a conversation that Ellison proposed to have. I don't even know how many weeks ago, and we keep bumping it. And so let's do it. It's time.
Thanks, Tammy. Be able to see like the Google slide deck. And I thought if it's okay, I was going to leave it in this mode. I might take notes and make changes. Not meant to be very formal. I'm not presenting results. I'm really just interested in having a discussion about the potential to produce something. So the context coming into this discussion is that sometime in the spring, in response really to a special issue call from Environmental Science and Technology, I don't think, Tammy, it's unfair to say we weren't particularly feeling pressure to respond to that special issue, but it was unifying around environmental work and sustainable development goals. And it seemed to offer an opportunity to think a bit about what a product would look like out of our project. And so for that, we drafted up an abstract, and I'm just pulling out what I had drafted in that abstract as objectives for a scoping review. So the proposed paper was called something like Representations of Well-Being in Household Energy Transitions, a scoping review of evaluative and like measures or something like that. And so the objectives at the time that I proposed were that we would summarize from the basis of the scoping review, the measurements and metrics for well-being that are currently in use in energy climate models is what I said. And then identify near-term opportunities to improve survey-based data acquisition on household energy use, energy decisions, and people's well-being when it's represented in energy climate models. And those two objectives sort of came out of the conversations we've been having as a team, learning especially from Marissa and Karthik's work. How does well-being at the household level relate to how well-being is represented in models? There were sort of three themes that I thought we might try to pull out of the literature scoping review, which would be how energy climate models currently address well-being. What are some well-being conceptual frameworks as they relate to our particular project context? And then, what is the interest? I've observed an increased interest in non-traditional measures of impacts and benefits of energy transition. So for instance, energy efficiency programs in the United States have been around for several decades and have been largely motivated through Department of Energy through lower utility costs And yet there's been increasing interest in non-energy benefits. Like, does it make people's indoor air quality better? Does it make their experience in their home better? So that was a theme that I thought we might enter that scoping review looking for. But this is just the outline that I had proposed to try to get something on paper, and that's several months ago. And I don't think that's any more the paper to write. I do think it's possibly still headed down a useful track. And so for today's discussion, what I was hoping we could talk about is there a product to create? If so, who's it for? I've thought about how it could be valid for us to want to create something for ourselves that might serve something else, or it could be a paper in the more traditional academic sense where we write out a motivation, a set of objectives, and we seek to implement an analysis. I'm somewhat interested in the latter, but I'm not convinced yet that that's the right route to go. In part, it's because I'm not as confident as I'd like to be yet. The scholarly literature needs another paper that's thinking about how to conceive of well-being in a particular context. It seems a lot of papers like that have been written for different contexts, but there's not a lot of crosstalk between them. The other thing is that in this particular project, I view Karthik and Narasimha's work as really, well-being focused. Karthik, your presentation last week or 2 weeks ago, was it last? I don't remember. Yeah, it was really helpful. And I love the work that you're doing. So I pulled this figure out of your presentation. For those that maybe don't recall, this was maybe 2/3 of the way through the presentation. Karthik presented this figure mapping out well-being in a consumption space, and showing it in the middle subjective well-being as being contributed to by eudaimonic, purpose meaning type well-being, evaluative, self-reflection on life satisfaction, and then hedonic, which is more immediate smile, worry, anger, with examples that Karthik included. And that there are these consumption categories and consumption indicators that might be used to understand well-being and also to understand their relative contribution to well-being. Hope that's not butchering it too much, Karthik. So a question that I've been grappling with is, like, do we even really need to consider well-being in other ways for this project as it relates to like a paper? Like, I think we do think about well-being, as we wrote up our scope for qualitative analyses. Chris, the interview questions that you've written are informed by our conversations about well-being. The participatory system mapping outline, Adam, that you drafted, it's also informed by our concepts of well-being. And I think where I'm at is trying to think about what, if there's a paper, who's it for and what is it trying to accomplish? So I wanted to give some examples. I think I might have these in the wrong order, of outputs that I thought might come out of an exercise where we try to produce a paper about how well-being in residential environments and energy transitions is represented in the literature. By doing that scoping review for ourselves, we might generate some outputs that are useful. And I wanted to give one example of the kinds of like tables or figures that I think could come out of that, and then hopefully just talk about some of this. Are there any questions to this point, or lack of, or is what I'm saying making sense?
Ellison, I think you're doing a great job of putting this in the context of both the field and the project.
Okay.
Just to clarify, we're no longer shooting for the ES&T, right? Because we didn't answer them, and then we kind of diddled around, and it's probably due by now. On the other hand, the way special issues go, everybody does that, and then they extend the deadline for many months. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the deadline that's on paper was like July 31st. So we would not make that. I have the same experience though, where special issues have just gone on for seemingly forever. And so I didn't feel that hidebound, like, oh, we can't do that because that deadline's passed. I think we could. I think between when we submitted this and given the time to reflect, I guess I've experienced a lot of personal hesitancy because it's not clear to me what would be making what I would feel like is a meaningful contribution. I think we could write a paper that's like, we read 25 papers about well-being in the indoor environment, and none of them talked about it the way we did. So we're going to talk about it the way we want to, and then we're going to write that paper, and we're going to add to that pile of ways of thinking about it. What I have seen, again, cursorily, or like not so systematically, but just like by looking at papers, I'm not greedy for citations, but a lot of them have like, 20 citations. They don't seem to be very well read because they don't think they're offering a lot that's useful to others. So and not to degrade or denigrate the quality of the paper either. I think it's just the question they're answering was more useful to them as a team, or more useful for learning about what they did in a particular project. There have been some, I would call them somewhat high profile energy transition programs, like in the UK and Wales, that have done a nice job of gathering data on psychosocial factors that were influenced by energy transitions. And they've written some nice papers about what they observed. And then from that, they've pulled out their concept for well-being as it relates to the residential environment, including energy in that equation. But it's not very transferable. Like the next program that shows up is in a different place, in a different context, where factors that influence well-being seem to, have different weights. And so I haven't seen those types of papers address questions that are part of that move the conversation forward in terms of understanding how to think about well-being. It seems like each new field-based setting or program that goes into place almost has to think about it again from the beginning. And I'm not really critique of the field. It's just that as I keep encountering that kind of paper, I think about what we could write right now. Feels like it would be very similar. But yet we're in a position on this project where I think we could think about how we could contribute in a different way to that conversation. So ES&T, maybe back to your earlier question, if they keep that special issue open, I think the umbrella topic is still a nice umbrella under which to position a paper we could write. At the same time, I don't right now have that as the endpoint in my mind, because I did want to generate some discussion here about what we would be trying to do. And I promise there's not a lot more slides, so it'll mostly be discussion. But I thought I'd
That was a long way of saying no.
yeah.
But maybe like when we figure out something, we could approach them if we decide to write a paper and say, hey,
Yeah.
We are working on this if that happens to be the case.
Right.
Fit in your special issue in terms of both topic and timing, and give them the chance to respond. Okay.
Yeah. So I just moved some things around because I think it makes more sense. I know that you all have heard me talk before about the Maria Uchi paper in 2019 that was well-being and the built environment, a scoping review of conceptual frameworks. So that's the paper from which I had pulled this figure that we've looked at before. This was figure 3 in that well-being and buildings scoping review results. So well-being and buildings is at the center of this conceptual framework. And then what's shown around it in varying sized circles are these different domains or themes and sub-themes of well-being. And they're not quantitative, but they're scaled to demonstrate or illustrate how common the themes are in the literature that was reviewed. And what was reviewed, I think, was on the order of maybe 50 papers. So environmental quality, satisfaction, comfort, shown here on the bottom right, is the theme, and then sub themes within that would be comfort, control, building design, indoor environmental quality. And the size of that circle indicates that that's the top theme that showed up in the scoping review of these 50 papers, 50 plus papers, when restricting the search to well-being in buildings.
So,
Oh yeah,
question,
go ahead.
that's how often it appears, not how important it is.
Yes,
That's what
this
the authors are focused on, not what people are focused on, right?
right. So they are very much in this review, they were very focused on just reflecting back what the literature has placed importance on, as measured by frequency, if it was
Okay.
considered.
And a
So,
second
yeah.
question,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
has that paper been published? Because I've
Uh,
looked for it and I haven't been able to find it.
Yeah, so this is, I thought I had found it, but what I found was like a dissertation. So I'm not sure this ended up getting published finally. Like it was a draft.
Really useful review.
Mhm.
So
But
anyway,
I share your same challenge. I could write her actually and ask if what
yeah,
happened,
think
but
that
like
would be good.
what
And-
she had shared with me was it had like, you know, maybe even I shared it with all you, it had like the draft across the PDF.
Mhm.
So I figured it was like at a proof stage.
But I think maybe instead of writing our own paper, we should encourage her to publish.
Yeah, right. I feel like that could be very useful. This table is sort of what underlays that figure. So these are the conceptual themes. Each bar represents a different environmental scale. So there are buildings, there are neighborhoods, sort of the built environment more vaguely defined, and then there are places. This is all just reflecting how the papers framed themselves. And then the themes are pattern coded, and I wouldn't get too caught up in trying to figure out if it's a wavy line or a dashed line. But each of these domains, environmental, mental health, physical health, hedonic, etc., eudaimonic, they show up in this figure, in these themes here. And so what this table does is just show you the percent of papers that considered environmental quality, looking at just those that were place-based papers, those that were built environment-based papers. So these data are what underlay that figure. At an even more granular level, they have this table where each row represents a paper, an individual paper, and then each column here, if you can see the heading, there's an ENB, HED. These are the same themes: environmental, hedonic, physical health, mental health. So then there's an X if they by their criteria, the authors of this paper considered this paper to have these themes in it. And then just one more way of representing it, they have the summary. So again, these different places, the different conceptual themes, I would say table 2 and figure 2 are the same data exactly. The reason I'm showing you these is that what I wanted to share here is when I think about an output that would be useful from this project, it would be tables like these. In order to sort of know where your qualitative interviews are including questions about well-being. And those questions about well-being are informed by conceptual frameworks that we've looked at in papers that we've read. I would like to more systematically review what's the body of literature that's informing our operationalizing these themes of well-being in the project. And so I could see doing a scoping review where we take 20 to 50 papers. We have these well-being conceptual themes. We have categories instead of environmental scales. We could have types of changes in homes or types of energy changes in homes, like appliance uptake versus like air sealing and insulation or energy efficiency measures, weatherization. Like I could see a couple of different themes on energy change in the home emerging as our categories, and then look at how well-being is represented in the literature. So we would have a table like this and a table like this, where we'd have the papers that are informing our well-being measures and questions. We could sort of have mapped out where that comes from the literature we've read. And the last thing I'll sort of close on is that I think that the process of building those kinds of tables or maps, again, they could become a paper. I'm not yet there yet, but I think doing this work would give us a stronger justification for the measures that could be used to assess well-being, which ones apply to our project context, and why are they appropriate, and why are others less appropriate. I think Karthik, your work helps us understand some of the things that are less appropriate also, and that could be part of what informs how we conceive of well-being for this project. I think two other outputs that could so the particular work of a scoping review, I think would also maybe produce a typology or archetypes of household energy changes that would inform or help us justify, like, we're going to focus on heating and cooling system changes, or changes like heat pump specifically. Out of the universe of household energy changes that are possible, we're only focusing on these, and we know why. Because we think they relate back to this important well-being theme. Alternatively, if we don't want to be focused on a single type of household energy change, we could use the typology or archetypes of household energy changes that we'd have to write about for a paper like this, to illustrate heterogeneity and maybe serve some of our heterogeneity goals, Tammy, from the original proposal. I don't know if that's making sense, but I think in order to get to like 4 rows here, categories of household energy change, we would have to go through a process of saying, here are the types of changes. Like, people can glaze their windows, or they can put a solar panel on their roof, or they can seal their garage off from their house. Like, there's lots of different ways people can make energy changes to the home, and they probably act through different mechanisms to affect well-being. Those that affect thermal comfort are going to maybe act through that environmental quality or thermal comfort domain of well-being, but those that lower utility costs, might act through a more financial mechanism to influence well-being. And I'm not saying there's only one path for each energy change, but it would be nice to have in my head, it would be nice to have an architecture of, like, this is the universe of household energy changes, and here are some that we're not considering, and here are some we are, because we think they're more along these mechanistic pathways to well-being. So the top 2 here are outputs that I think could happen within the scope of our first 2 years. They'd be part of writing this paper. A third thing that I'm less familiar with psychometric analyses than other people on this call, but one thing that came to mind as I've seen all these different papers pop up that are trying to address well-being when households undergo change or household energy transitions happen, there's pretty limited systematic approaches to validating measures that we would use about people in their homes to understand well-being. And so maybe there's some specific psychometric analyses that we could even pursue in our own field work that would serve the field more broadly, but that could also be like recommendations that come out of this paper, would be like, here are some places we see as being powerful opportunities to standardize how people working in this interdisciplinary space conduct well-being research. So that sort of summarizes outputs that I thought would be useful from an exercise like trying to write a paper. I think I didn't have like a good like closing slide. Maybe I'll just leave it here. We still have about 20 minutes. I wanted to then just stop here and maybe go back to these are the questions that I have. Is there a product to create? If so, for whom? And what should the objectives be? So maybe I'll stop there and leave it at this slide. See what people think. I just saw there was some chat. Oh, thank you. Oh, Radul found it.
Yeah,
Good job, Radul. Thanks.
Thank you.
When did it actually get published? Was it 2020?
19.
2019. Okay.
it's a while ago.
Yeah. It's gotten, I wonder if it's gotten cited. I haven't really seen. Okay.
I don't know why I didn't find it, but thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah, no problem.
Ellison, great questions here. And I really appreciate the way you've pushed this toward meta-analysis of the problem rather than just analysis. Well, I have thoughts, but I want to let other people, because I feel like I talk a lot.
Apologies if this kind of pulls us in a bad direction or maybe not exactly where we want to go. But Ellison, one conversation that you and I have had a couple times, and we may have also had as a group, is when we're thinking about psychometric indicators of well-being, which should we even suspect would be plausibly changed by something like a home retrofit. To me, it's an open question if you would expect that like life satisfaction would improve because someone has new windows. So I think that figuring out, the which I don't think is all that clear in the literature yet, what indicators are sort of actually useful, and so we're not kind of barking up the wrong tree. I'm sure there's lots of kind of generic indicators of well-being on kind of a large scale, for lack of a better term, that probably aren't, improving your house is probably not going to fix your depression, I guess is what I'm saying, right? So I think that's kind of a question that to maybe grapple with. And if maybe there is a specific, I'm sure there's people that have asked about, like, I know they've seen things on like household satisfaction with indoor air quality, et cetera, et cetera. Figuring out what plausible causal pathways are there from a home retrofit to maybe very granular indicators of satisfaction or well-being with the home specifically, and what connections those might have to, kind of, I don't know what you would call them, more broad or sweeping indicators of well-being, like life satisfaction, for example. So, I don't know if that's enough for a paper per se, but it's definitely, to me, an open question, exactly how that works.
Yeah, if I may just respond briefly to that, I would agree, Adam, that that's where my mind goes and why a scoping review, and I keep saying scoping because systematic can be so big as that I don't think we would necessarily accomplish it in the span of this project or the first 2 years of it. But I see the value of framing our work towards a paper as a scoping review, because I think we could map out, like I can actually think of a paper I just looked at this morning for this, that, in the abstract states, we found an association between improved indoor air quality and less depression, but it's not a very well done study. So the value of a scoping review would be to apply these standardized criteria for weight of evidence, quality of study, and I think help move the field away from, we measured what we could, that are well-being measures that we could wedge into a study that we were already doing, and lo and behold, we found an association. And that sits there as like now a finding that's been peer reviewed. And so you can't say like, oh, that doesn't, indoor air quality can improve. Better indoor air quality can improve your depression state. When I think what you're saying at least, my hypothesis, like it's unlikely that getting better insulation in your home is going to really address root causes of depression. And I think the hunger for other impacts of changes to the home has led to some sloppy work in introducing well-being measures into those types of studies. And I don't think we need to be overly critical about it, but I think a scoping review would help lay out, like, here's what it would look like for people moving forward to try to address these things. And here's, like what you were saying, Adam, here are things that have some strong mechanistic connections that, yeah, stuff there.
Ellison, I want to bring up something that you said that I thought was actually very interesting, and it may relate to the question we're discussing now. So you said that there had been a number of presentations of well-being in its many facets in a particular situation, and they were typically each centered around a project, or done because a project was being conducted, and so they needed to have this framing. And the thing you said that I thought was interesting was everybody felt like they needed to do it for themselves. Why? What is it that makes translation of another framework imperfect?
I mean, I have some thoughts on it. I don't know. They're not very well researched.
Go for it. Yeah, we're all in speculation mode here, so
Okay.
nothing has to be supported.
So, and Karthik, I think you have better data, or you've had more thorough analysis of this. One reason that I think it crops up that way, that within a project team, or even, like it's a transdisciplinary team, let's say, like there's on the ground field practitioners and there are researchers, and they want to learn about well-being or psychosocial factors that are influenced by a energy transition. They look at their specific context and they say, we can't use what these people found because our context is too different. And so the best example I have of that is housing insecurity. So when what I would say are measures of well-being are measured in people who go from homeless to more securely housed, or housing insecurity to more security, the researchers' choice has been to say, well, we're going to use these measures of well-being because we're talking about people that are going from no homes to having homes. And so it's almost cherry picking's, I think, overused, but it's like they know there are many measures, but they decide, well, we're just going to look at hedonic measures because these people are really poor and we're going to put them in more secure housing. And so we expect that their hedonic well-being is going to go up. And I think what I'm trying to say is there hasn't been the work to justify why they discarded everything else. Kind of like what Adam is saying. Like there's too many things in the well-being bucket of measurement tools. And so people pick and choose. And when they pick and choose, the rationales for making those decisions are based on their read of their context, and they're probably not totally wrong. My guess is they're not totally wrong. They're trying to be judicious, right? Because they don't want to say, well, we're not going to address well-being at all. We can't do it comprehensively, so we're not going to do it at all. Instead, they're like, well, we can do it partially, and we're going to make some assumptions about our context. And in order to justify it, because there isn't a standardized way to make that decision, they sort of reinvent a framework. And they maybe don't publish a new paper on it, but they sort of within their paper are like, here's our framework. it's sort of like these other frameworks, but it's a little different because then it helps us make it clear why we just went with this 1 or 2 measures. I don't know, Karthik, if you
I
have
that
thoughts on it.
that sounds about right, because yeah, I think the different channels that you mentioned, I think nobody knows what these channels are. And even for like one domain of well-being, there are different ways to measure it, right? Like energy insecurity is probably a million different ways. So you're cold in your house, you face disconnection. So yeah, as you said, everybody picks and chooses which measure, well, they have access to, right? And then just go with it. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of value in mapping out change versus well-being and seeing how it's been done. Because yeah, we don't know what changes, we don't really know what well-being is either. So
And I could be off base on this, but my sense is that there's a lot more literature on, say, something like, say, energy insecurity and some indicator of well-being, as opposed to we actually measured when households made a change to their home in some way, like a physical, tangible change in this and a well-being indicator. In other words, there's lots of like sort of perceptual surveys of people with varying degrees of energy insecurity, and you can see, okay, well, these folks are reporting more symptoms, or they're reporting lower self-rated health or something like that. But comparatively less work that's about, we can show this home made a change
change.
and this indicator of well-being improved, or even this home is no longer energy insecure for that matter, maybe because they moved somewhere else. I don't know, they got a raise, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot less work of that type, which I guess the way I'm thinking of it would require panel data, of course, like we talked about before, but even sort of retrospectively, you could do certain things. Maybe you could do matching, or there's ways you could get at that answer. So those might be two different phenomenon, I guess. The sort of static level of energy insecurity, or maybe reporting or air quality or whatever there is, versus somebody made a change and this is their well-being improved.
But then that is also assuming that there is a connection between the both. Are we sure of that connection? Or yeah, I don't know.
Oh, can you say a little more, Karthik? I probably agree
just
with you, but
just if well-being and change are connected, or if
oh,
the lack of well-being is the driver to change.
mhm.
Well, again, that depends on how you define well-being, right? If it's just economic well-being, you're not able to pay your bills, that's it, right? So yeah, thermal comfort, well, yeah, we don't know, right? So
Yeah, well, so what you're touching on for me, Karthik, is what I keep coming back to, because I think for the last year, while I've been thinking about well-being and change, I've been like, oh yeah, of course, thermal comfort's talked about a lot. There's lots of papers on it. None of them are directly about well-being changes per se, but well-being and thermal comfort, it has been studied in various ways. And I've kind of discarded it, but only recently I've kind of come back because of what you're saying. Like, if we think about a deficit in well-being driving a change, not all deficits in well-being are experienced or conscious, and people vary in their ability to notice deficits of well-being. But thermal comfort, in my experience, and the more I've asked people about this in the studies that we've done, the more I've realized, like, it's been kind of right. It feels like, oh, it's been in front of me the whole time. People always talk about what they do with respect to being hot or cold in their home. They walk into their home and they want to adjust the temperature somehow within whatever bounds they have. And so as a driver of, or as an experience of deficit, it seems experienced for lots of people, maybe not all, but more than from, hedonic well-being, let's say, or even more so like eudaimonic well-being. But it seems to induce a change behaviorally on many different temporal scales, including up to the scale of like these major changes, like changing the appliances in your home. And the experience of the change that occurs for your well-being is also experienced. Like, it's all along the same pathway. And so I put this in because I was trying to put down questions for myself of like what's been just really bothering me about trying to write something that's like, should we just narrow the focus? And then what is the contribution if we narrow the focus? Is it too narrowed? And I still don't have an answer.
And I'm not sure there is a right answer,
Yeah.
but there could be an answer that we agree would be both productive for the project and interesting for us. And potentially interesting for other people too.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to get my head around the things that are being brought forward, because I see some common themes. I'm not sure I'm able to articulate them yet, but so one is one that I've been thinking about, and you bring it up again with the thermal comfort, and that is something like a deficit can dominate your perception of well-being so that you don't notice others. So if you're hungry, that's just it, you know, or if your kids are hungry, that is the thing you're going to work on. And so I've been thinking of, there's multifaceted well-being, but like one or two or three of them, probably not more, are going to dominate. And thermal comfort seems to be one of them, right? Like if you're cold, if you're really cold, you're just going to try to get warm. Nothing else, right?
Right.
And I think that insecurity in two ways is one is if you're at physical risk, or if there's constant violence around you, then you're really focused on that. And then long-term insecurity in terms of whether you'll receive a benefit from investing at all, right? Like, so those things seem to dominate. So I don't, and then once you've gotten rid of those, I don't know if this is a hierarchy of needs kind of thing. Because I'm not sure I 100% buy into the pyramid, right? But I feel like it's the intensity, like you feel the deficit. Some people feel certain deficits worse, and then those drive your behavior. And that is one reason that I'm reluctant to just focus on a single dimension, because part of the project is thinking about decision making. And I'm afraid, I know that it can be right and very productive to focus on a single thing and just figure out what's wrong with it. And yet we also, one of the reasons we kind of opened it up to complexity is that we know decision making. So like sometimes most of the time, you're not even in the space to make a decision because of the other things that are going on for you. So
Right.
that's not an answer. That's not a pronouncement on what I think we should do, Ellison. Only I think that some structured way of thinking about complexity, I feel like might be more. Well, it'll help me more. I don't know if it'll help anybody else.
Well, so that's really why this first bullet to me is that leaning towards embracing a more complex path for writing a paper or producing something for our team. I do think it's tempting sometimes to just restrict down to one domain and get it really right, but I think addressing complexity in a systematic way and potentially, like following up on what Adam said, using the literature to at least assess what mechanistically has an evidence base and what has maybe been evaluated but lacks the evidence or has a much weaker evidence base for a mechanistic relationship. That seems like it could be a useful output. And I say that because I don't think any paper has done that yet, where there's been an evaluation on established criteria for which it already exists. Like we don't have to go come up with the criteria for evaluating papers. but we could apply existing criteria to a set of papers and then have that help us reveal, like, here, there's a lot of evidence for how this mechanistically relates to well-being, you know, this change in the home. And here's where there's not. And that doesn't mean that it can't be further interrogated. It just means, like, instead of what I think happens right now is, like, if there's a paper that shows a relationship between indoor environmental quality and depression, it's like, okay, well, that's a thing. So we can include that in our study. And it's not, it's given as much weight now as, like, I'm going to talk about thermal comfort and well-being. I don't see a lot of differentiation on quality of evidence base. And I think we could potentially contribute something like that through a review process. And I'm somewhat motivated to, like, or meaning, like, I feel like my interest and time spent on this, you know, for this project could go in that direction. But and I should add, I wasn't necessarily expecting to, like, get the resolution, but I did want people to know how I've been thinking about this, and if they had sort of strong opinions forming about what would be useful for our team, what would or wouldn't be valuable for the scientific community or scholarly community, maybe even practitioner.
I think this is useful though, because I feel like we've been hashing about with a bunch of different things, discussions of well-being, and a sort of feeling that as long as we do something that's slightly complex, it's going to be good enough. And then an underlying that feeling that, like, oh, but we really are justified. So this clearly needs more discussion. I think, Ellison, now that you've gone through these presentations, we can begin with the questions that you want to ask. And I might flip the order of your three questions, like, what would the objectives be? And then,
Okay.
and then the first one, is there a product, comes last. Like, if we can't come up with objectives, there's no product, right?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's actually that. I mean, sort of, I was looking for that. I could go forward and pretty readily write us more objectives than could fit into one paper. Like, there are things that I would really like to develop some understanding of. Would you like me to, I like having a presentation deadline to drive the work forward.
Well, I wonder about
How do you wanna
continuing the
do this?
discussion some more, and I'm wondering if we should take us, like, who's interested, who wants to be in that discussion? And then see if we can find a time for that smaller group to meet specifically to follow on some of your questions, because I feel like you could sit down and write something. It's probably going to be more effective to have people bouncing off each other for a little while longer. I don't feel like we're at the give it to one person to write up stage. Do you?
I don't. I mean, I could. I think it would be misguided. I think it'd be premature.
It seems like the kind of thing where I'd go in a room and go, crap, I got to work on this, and then nothing comes out.
Oh, I think I'm more worried. I would come up with something, but it'd be uninformed by the smart people in this room. So
Okay,
would
show of
do a-
hands, who wants to be in further discussions? Who? Okay, yeah, like real hands is good. Okay. So Kartik, me, Adam, and Chris. Okay. So let's see. And I would guess that Narasimha will put himself in. I'll give him the chance to vote. Because I think this is having, like, things that you're saying between the lines, Ellison, are noticeable and important. And so I want to be able to bring those out, bring them into the light before we start coalescing on this.
Okay.
Cool. And so what I would like to do is schedule this not on a Friday time, but just find a time to, as soon as possible, to see if we can move it forward.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that together.
Thanks for creating a space. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk. Thanks everyone for listening and sharing your thoughts. If
I
more
think
come to
it's-
mind later, please.
Yeah, it's important for the group. So
Mhm.
thank you. Okay, everyone, have a good weekend. See you
Yeah.
next week. Next week when we talk about the very, very interesting annual reports. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.